All right, so now we want to start adding some textures and whatnot on here because we've got the basic color, but it's very flat and very cartoony. So we're going to make it look a little bit more realistic by adding some textures to some of these things. I'm going to start with my borders and legs. And in the past, I've taught you how to create your own brushes. I'm going to do that again and create a curtain texture, just to get the sort of folds and fabric of the curtain in here. So I have already selected an image that I'm going to use to start with because it's got really nice deep folds, nice highlights and shadows. I think this is going to work really well. So I'm going to actually create two separate brushes from this. So the first one, I've already done one. I've put it on its own layer here so you can see it. So I've made a selection and because of the way this image is, let's go back to that a little for a second. You can kind of see this has some perspective to it. And in order for this to work for us, for this project, I really need this to be kind of straight up and down because my legs and borders don't necessarily have that same shape. We're not dealing with this perspective just yet. We really just want that texture on there. So a new tool to work with, a couple of new tools, not the polygon tool. But we're going to use some transform tools here. And first of all, I'm going to find a nice selection. So I'm making two different brushes. This one here that I've already made to use for the legs. So I get a nice long, tall brush for that. And then I need a brush for the borders to go across. So for that, I'm just going to find, and I'm going to follow these shapes. So this one, I've got a nice highlight on it, and I'm going to make it nice and wide. So I've got one wide and one wide and short and one narrow and tall. And the outside of this, I'm going to make sure is a shade color so that when I go and apply these textures on my surface, it will be highlight on one side, shade on the other, and hopefully a seamless finish here. Once I complete that selection, it automatically sets that. All right, so we can see how it's not a rectangle, and if I had made a brush right out of this, which I could, it would also have this sort of angle on it, and it will be harder to line up across if I go back to here, I want to make this texture go all the way across. And I could just enlarge the brush and make it fit all the way across, but then that's going to look unrealistic because the texture is too big. So back to here. So I'm going to make sure that I'm on my background layer here, and I'm going to copy this selection, Control C or Command C if you're on a Mac, and then Command V to paste that. It will automatically create that on a new layer. So I can turn this background layer off. I don't need that background layer anymore. But I do need to sort of square this up. And if I just simply took my rectangular tool here, especially for this texture, you can kind of see how I'm going to cut off some of that layer. It's not going to work. So, instead of doing that, I'm going to make the selection over the whole thing again. And I'm going to use a couple of different transform tools. Because this is relatively set in a perspective, I'm going to use the perspective transform. So when I use this, I can grab that top, which is narrower. So I drag that corner out. When you drag the corners, it is going to, because of the perspective tool the way it is, drag both corners open. So now the top is a little bit wider. You can also grab the middle and kind of do both at the same time. Now one tool that Photoshop has is the grid under View, I believe. Down to Show and Show Grid. Now the grid is literally a grid, and so you can kind of use this to help eyeball whether or not you are in fact getting your image square when you're doing that transform. So the grid can be a pretty effective um, tool for that. So that's probably about as close as I'm going to get. There's a bit of a bow here and maybe a little bit wider there. So that side's pretty good. And I'm going to turn that grid back off and hit return to set that selection and be okay. So from here, I could probably take my rectangular marquee, choose the deselect, and just kind of grab just a little bit. That amount of warpage wouldn't be a big deal, but I do want to take this opportunity to show you one more kind of interesting transform tool, and that is the warp tool. So with warp, for this one, you can actually kind of, we're not necessarily going to do that for this, but just for future references. I really like the warp tool sometimes. But this one is going to allow me to sort of straighten up that edge without having to do a whole lot of other techniques. And then I don't lose as much of my corner. Okay, so from here I am just going to make sure that's squared up. So I only lost a little bit. Let's do the same thing on this side just to make sure it's square. Because again, we want this brush to be able to line up as we use it across. And then the last step, I'm just going to go to my levels just a little bit and increase the contrast ever so much. I don't want to lose these nice mid-tone details in here. It's already pretty dark, so I'm just going to leave that slider where it is. And from there, I can define my brush preset, curtain border. And there we go. It has created my brush for me. So if I go back to my project here, and I'm going to apply that, I'm going to use that brush on top of my first border, probably this grand drape border. So I need to find that layer, and border one, I want to make that selection. So now that I have this border and it's filled in with a solid color, I can hold the command key and click in that, and it will bring up my selection. Choose an appropriate color. I want to get something that's in the same color family, but just a little bit darker. This is why we want these to be just ever so slightly lighter, so you can work with them a little cleaner here. And I can zoom in so I can see my progress a little bit better, and just you can still change the brush size if you need to. So if you do this and you feel like it's too big, you can always go a little bit smaller. And I also have this set in the overlay mode. Right now it's at 100%. You might need to adjust some of these settings. Maybe you don't want it to be quite so bright, so let's undo that, or quite so dark perhaps. You want some of that undercolor to show through some more. So let's set the opacity a little bit lower. That looks pretty good. And now, because we have that nice rectangle, I can zoom in, make sure that that is placed side by side. If you get a bit of a, if you don't place it at exactly the right spot and you get that highlight, just undo, go back in, and click on that. And just keep kind of going all the way across. And we have some nice curtains in there. You can do the same thing for pretty much all the rest of these. So if I choose border 2, and this time instead of red, I want it to be more in the gray to black family. Maybe make the brush just a little bit smaller. Might be a little too small. Here's a good time to point out the shortcut for making your brushes smaller and larger. If you look at the 2 buttons to the right of your P on your keyboard, at least on mine, I think this is fairly universal, you have the bracket keys. And so if you click the button right next to the P, the bracket, it makes your brush smaller, and then the closed bracket next to that makes your brush bigger. So you can actually change the size of your brush very quickly by knowing that shortcut. And again, we can go in here, and I'm just doing this directly on the layer. I could do this in its own separate layer and then have some more editability, but because these are legs and borders, I'm not going to be too concerned about that. All right, so keep going there. And then I want to go to my legs, and I'm going to use my other brush that I've already created. So I've probably called that one Curtain Tall. You can name it whatever you want. Notice it doesn't quite go top to bottom, so I'm going to actually increase the size of that just so it will. You could make it smaller and try to line it up. It's a little bit harder to line up top to bottom because we don't necessarily have the top and bottom of that brush lined up perfectly. So you're more likely going to see that edge. And I just realized I used the wrong color. So I'm going to undo. I'm going to go back over to my color picker over here because it remembers the last several colors you used. And click in there, and then again, same thing on the rest of the legs and borders.